the crowd reaction. On behalf of the staff and board of the Wallace Global Fund, I'm really happy to welcome you to what is going to be a great discussion tonight. This is going to be the first in a series of upcoming events linking new publications with critical issues and strategies of the day, with movement partners participating in the discussions that are on the front lines of advancing strategies. And tonight's book, we're very excited, is Unlikely Heroes, Franklin Roosevelt, His Four Lieutenants, and the World They Made, by Derek Leebaert, who is here and will be joining the stage in a moment. And the book is really such a wonderful read, and you'll have the chance to have a conversation and a signing with Derek after the discussion. It really frames in such a fascinating way the leaders who shaped the New Deal. But what's so exciting about our conversation tonight is the parallels between today and the New Deal era, which are extraordinary. And Dorian will be laying some of that out as well with Scott Wallace, the co-chair of the board of Wallace Global Fund. But the rising authoritarianism in the US and globally, the mounting economic crisis, and then of course today, compounded by the existential threat of climate change. At Wallace Global Fund, I have to say, we are so honored to work with and support a remarkable group of activists and leaders to meet these challenges, notably through the advocacy for a Green New Deal, which led to last year's suite of transformative policies that includes the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'll, of course, be getting into that more tonight. But these sweeping policies are, in fact, the spirit of the original New Deal. And the battle of today is about moving this vision forward and defending it. Because we cannot just be about trying to implement it, but we have to block and tackle what we know will be very significant opposition. So we're thrilled that our co-chair, Scott Wallace, will be in conversation with Derek about the New Deal legacy shaped by his visionary grandfather, Henry Wallace. And before I turn the microphone over to Tope, I really want to thank our co-sponsors. First and foremost, Busboys and Poets. Hello. What an extraordinary space for our movements, our progressive activism. We've all been to many events that have been sponsored by Busboys and hosted at Busboys. And we're sorry that Andy couldn't be here tonight, but we really want to thank all of the Busboys staff and who are helping us right now in this room. And we also have Gohar Siddiqui from the Congressional Progressive Caucus here. Gohar here, another one of our co-sponsors. And then the Institute for Policy Studies. And many of the team of IPS is here, but particular thanks to John Cabana, Nefta Freeman, and I will turn it over to IPS's not so new Executive Director, Tope Polari. And before I turn it over, I of course have to note, books will be for sale, and you can get Derek to sign them for you afterwards. So, Tope.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here. We're so incredibly excited to be helping to support the launch of this wonderful book. I cannot wait for this conversation. Ellen, we are so happy that we've been supported by Wallace Global for the past 30 years, Ellen, today, which is an incredible legacy. We're going to be here for work with them, so thank you for that support. As she said, I'm Tope Polari, the Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Studies. IPS has been around for 60 years now. We're incredibly proud of our legacy of supporting social movements, both here in this country and abroad in a variety of ways: research, communications, analysis support. We're incredibly proud of the work we do, and we're proud to be supporting a series In my other life, I'm a writer, I write fiction, so books are very, very important to me. We're very happy about this series and the opportunity to elevate both nonfiction and fiction writers and activists as well in a series of conversations about all kinds of issues. We're working on this slate right now, but we'll get that information to you shortly. I sincerely hope that all of you who are here and those of you who are watching online can join us in those conversations. My job here is to introduce Dorian Warren, the co-president of Community Change, doing incredibly important work. And he's become a friend as well. As Ellen mentioned, I kind of knew in my role at IPS, and I've picked up the phone many times to call Dorian and emails as well, and he's been a great help. So thank you so much, Dorian. It's a pleasure to be introducing you, and I'll pass the mic to you now.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I think we can do better than that. You don't have a drink in your hand? Good evening, everyone. Okay, thank you to both Ellen and Tope. Thank you, Tope, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Ellen and Wallace Global, for co-sponsoring this event. And I'm so excited to get into this conversation, and I'm gonna spare the introductions, except I'm gonna say one word about the book, which if you don't have it already, you should make sure you purchase it and get it signed by Derek. But there are 4 really specific people that he covers in this book: Harry Hopkins, Harold Ickes, Francis Perkins, and the grandfather of one of our panelists, Henry Wallace. And so these 4 figures really shaped the New Deal and drew us out of crisis in the 1930s. And so we're gonna jump in to this conversation. I want to start by asking Derek to tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book. Like, why did you want to write this book? Why do you want to write it now? And why did you choose to focus on these 4 lieutenants of FDR, who, by the way, served from 1933 until his death in 1945?
A famous historian, William Roger Lewis at Texas, observed that no one has gotten FDR right. And as I looked closer and closer at Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, I realized that it was surrounded more by myth than any administration in US history. The reason is pretty clear, because the iconic histories were written very soon after his death, 1948 and through the 50s. And by and large, historians have repeated these stories. They have always focused on the Titanic leader himself, FDR. Rarely, if ever, have they looked wider and deeper to identify the 4 closest associates, the only individuals who were at the top of his administration from the very beginning until the very end in a hands-on operating role. And the closer I looked at this curiosity, I realized that this was the hard, tough, liberal core of FDR's presidency from the very beginning to the very end. Franklin Roosevelt was a notorious improviser, a brilliant politician, maneuvering constantly. However, each of these 4 arrived in 1933 in DC with a purpose and a vision and plans to execute. And they did that right until the end. And as I dug deeper, another curiosity revealed itself. Not only were these 4 friends, as they quickly became, but each of them in their own way was as wounded as was the polio-stricken president himself. And that was no coincidence.
I'm going to stick with you for one more question before going to Scott, Derek. And I'd like you to paint a picture of what the 4 lieutenants and the president were facing in 1933 when they came into office? What were the crises that they were facing? The once in a generation, there were crises unlike any time in the history of the country. So paint a picture for us of what they were facing and why their unique personas and strategies were so important to get us out of those crises.
Historians still debate the issue that, well, perhaps had FDR not arrived with his New Deal institution and reforms, the nation would have right-sized itself under Republican rugged individualism, trickle-down economics. I don't find any historical evidence for that at all. In May 1933, the US GDP had been devastated by a quarter loss, 25% collapse in GDP. Unemployment was nearly 20%. Not only that, the economic facts are chilling, but there was political extremist violence both on the left and on the right. FDR and his lieutenants knew this completely. If they failed during the 100 days of the initial New Deal legislation, if they failed, they had no illusions that the country would be torn apart one way or another. It could not go on business as usual.
So Scott, I want to get you in here and ask you first is to name that you have dedicated yourself to bringing forth the legacy of the New Deal to the present. So talk to us a little bit about what your work looks like now, but also what are some of the similarities and differences between the 1930s and this moment in which we find ourselves?
Well, the book does a fantastic job of drawing those parallels for us. It's very relevant to today. I saw the parallels a couple of years ago together with some other New Deal descendants, and we were spurred by someone else seeing the parallels, a guy named Joe Biden. There are all these articles being written about Biden planning a New Deal and loving the history of the New Deal and studying it. And so I got together with Jim Roosevelt, FDR's grandson, and Tomlin Perkins, Coggeshall, who is Francis Perkins' grandson, and June Hopkins, who is Harry Hopkins' granddaughter, and Harold Ickes, who is Harold Ickes' son. I always wondered why we were all grandchildren and he was a son. Well, Harold Ickes Sr. had multiple marriages, and his last one that produced Harold was a 40-year age difference. 23 or these are the tidbits you'll learn from the book.
Scandalous.
So we got together and we wrote a letter to candidate Joe Biden saying, here's the things we reckon. We know you love the New Deal and lionize FDR. Here's the priorities that we think that our ancestors would raise to you. And it came as a total surprise to us when we learned that Derek had written the book about precisely our 5 ancestors 2 years later. But since then, we've been doing op-eds and TV and Morning Joe, and we did a video that's on our website actually about the attacks on Social Security that's on our WGF website right now. I got an op-ed in the Chronicle of Philanthropy with Jim Roosevelt this morning about threats to the entire New Deal, not just the Republican debt ceiling plan and budget slashing, but this case that's in the Supreme Court to hold the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau unconstitutional, which would result in holding unconstitutional the Fed, the FDIC, and every other financial institution that regulates the health of the U.S. economy, and possibly putting Social Security and Medicare at risk too, because they are off appropriations. So the New Deal as a whole is fundamentally under assault. If I could read a section from Derek's book that makes this point early on. The 2020s raise uncomfortable parallels with those most world-changing, the most world-changing of years during the century, the 20th century. Social upheavals, climate extremes, the Dust Bowl, and an urge to rebuild the furious political and policy cry of America first, when mobility disorder threateningly increases. The gap between rich and poor, the risk of racial violence, the rise of fascism, both domestic and globally, the parallels just scream out at you, and Derek is very helpful in doing that. And, we get it, and we are trying to be a megaphone that speaks to both Biden and Congress and the wider public.
So, because you named it, Scott, the elephant, one of the elephants in the room, debt ceiling, budget battles. So, Derek, I'm going to ask you to talk to us a little bit about how FDR and his four lieutenants battled notions of trickle-down economics, battled around fiscal policy and economic policy in the 30s, because the book makes clear we're fighting some of the same battles. So tell us a story or two about how they confronted some of the same forces and villains that we're confronting right now.
Before 1933, it had never been conceived that the federal government would have a role in protecting the citizenry during peacetime as much as during war. Democrat, Republican administrations had been extremely minimalist in the role of government. Faced by a catastrophic depression, enormous millions of Americans being unemployed, the economy and the banking system collapsing, FDR and each of the four, they might not have known precisely what to do, but they knew it couldn't be business as usual. From the very beginning, these first 100 days of the New Deal, they were charged by the Republican right and sometimes by the Democratic right with being socialists, God forbid, even communists, because of their insistence that there was a role of government that had to defend the vulnerable at home. FDR set the tone. Each of the four lieutenants arrived in Washington during March, April, May, and June, 90 years ago to the day, with specific plans. For example, Scott's grandfather, Henry Wallace, was from Iowa, a famed geneticist, a scientist from a distinguished entrepreneurial farming family that had long stood for equity among the devastated farms of the heartland. Henry Wallace arrived in Washington with a plan to save the farming economy. Ditto Frances Perkins, the first woman in a presidential cabinet. She was 53 at the start of the administration. Henry Wallace was 45. Frances Perkins arrived with an absolute agenda, which she had made clear to FDR that she would not otherwise serve, to wipe out child labor, to enable union organizing, to deliver social security insurance, as it was then called, to have a minimum wage. And FDR, it was easy for him to say, sure, 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 sure. But these policies had to be executed and fought over and rammed through Congress at a time when it was still not taken remotely for granted that the federal government had a role in uplifting vulnerable, wounded Americans in the most ghastly economic crisis of our history.
Scott, I'll start with you on this question, and you feel free to respond to the previous one too. We have seen, we're living through a moment of the return of industrial policy. So if you look at what the Biden administration and the Congress passed in 2021 and 2022, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, this is a return to industrial policy, which one could argue was originated in the New Deal by FDR and the four lieutenants. And the obvious example here is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which created dams and provided power to some rural regions of the South. What does the New Deal, and what do we learn in the book? What lessons should we take about infrastructure investment, industrial policy, and active government intervention into shaping markets? What lessons should we take for now?
Well, one thing that has not changed a bit since the 1930s is this left-right battle, the do-nothing, laissez-faire, low taxes, small government, right, and then on the left, the people who believe the government has a responsibility to be a constructive force enabling people's opportunity and evening of opportunity and equality. And the struggle played out, as you say, in industrial policy. What they were accused of in 1933 as socialism, what turned out to be fantastic investment, not only in building infrastructure and building things that still last today, libraries and bridges and airports and roads, but they created jobs. I mean, FDR and his cabinet looked at this not just as an investment in the future, but as a very immediate way to solve the unemployment crisis. So, and that's what we have in common today. I mean, Biden, he invites historians over, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Meacham and Beschloss. He has them over for a couple-hour chat about lessons learned from the New Deal. And he sees...
Just be inviting Derek.
I know, I haven't gotten around to that yet, but maybe he's watching tonight. So. We did send a copy of the book to most members of Congress, all but the crazies, and immediately got a response back from Joe Manchin asking for a meeting. You know, can we learn something, maybe from the New Deal? Can Joe Manchin? Awesome. So I think that is the lens that Biden sees this infrastructure, this industrial policy through. It is not just tax and spend, it is investing in building things that will lift up everybody in the country. Stuff, and now it's including broadband and a clean energy economy. Thanks in no small part to the activism of young people, the engagement of movements of young people. The Sunrise Movement. And now we have movements growing around democracy. Democracy is under threat. So people have to rise up and make their voices heard. They are fed up and they're not going to take it anymore. Abortion, look at the movements that have arisen and showed their strength in Kansas, in Wisconsin, in Kentucky. This is massive people power. So that is what Biden is getting, that spending on these things is empowering people, is creating equality. And I think the next great movement that Joan Huffer is involved in is tax equality. Tax, to demand a fairer tax system, higher taxes on the ultra wealthy. The way to solve looming insolvency in Medicare and Social Security is not only to cut benefits and to privatize Social Security. There is the revenue side, which is totally ignored by the conservatives, by the entire Republican Party. So if there's a movement of people saying tax the rich, I know Patriotic Millionaires is here too, that's their signature issue, as well as raising the minimum wage. Those movements get attention and they get results.
FDR called this a common sense of decency. He and the four lieutenants didn't regard the New Deal reforms as collectivism remotely. Instead, they regarded it correctly as the highest order of American individualism. because from their perspective, the New Deal would give so many neglected, downtrodden Americans a shot at some semblance of equality through access to health care, to social insurance, to being able to join a union without being fired the next day. It was Americanism that they emphasized, and this did much to pull the country together. A good metric of this is that when FDR was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933, under the old constitutional calendar, it was customary to speak of our country as these United States of America. That is the old circumlocution of describing our country, these United States of America. By 1945, when FDR died, April 12th, 1945, it was undeniably referred to as the United States of America. And this is what he accomplished. Despite the searing unemployment, the devastation of the Great Depression, FDR and each of the four lieutenants also knew that America's role in the world was altering. The 1930s was the era of fascism, syndicalism, Nazism, communism. And America, they knew, had to confront these forces as well. FDR, for sure, and in time his four lieutenants, were highly attuned to the fate of a wider civilization beyond the United States. FDR spoke fluent French. His German was adequate. He read Spanish easily, and he had conversational Dutch. Henry Wallace, who ran the biggest department in government, the Department of Agriculture, taught himself Spanish very quickly. He spoke German, of course, being a scientist. Then he taught himself Russian and Portuguese because of his interest in Latin America. Frances Perkins spoke perfect French and German, and she herself was highly attuned to the world. And what has not been disclosed before is that Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor, highly oriented toward Europe, going constantly to Geneva for meetings of the International Labor Organization, became FDR's primary source of intelligence on the crumbling European balance. Come the run-up to the war was raging in Europe from September 1939 onward. It was Henry Wallace, who was still the Secretary of Agriculture. He would become vice president in 1941. He was rallying the country as a Midwesterner. He, as an Iowan, was exclaiming that the destiny of the United States and of Europe was inseparable. No one was saying this at the time. FDR couldn't say this, or didn't dare say it. The brawler, Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, everyone knew he wanted to go to war against anyone. But when Henry Wallace, from the Midwest, emphasized that civilization was at stake, as he was doing during 1940 and 1941, that was decisive in preparing America to enter the war. And as we were talking earlier today, I've concluded that it would have been extremely dicey at best for America to have won during the greatest, bloodiest war in history, World War II. It would have been highly questionable for us to have won without the New Deal. Had America gone stumbling through the years of the Great Depression in the 1930s with rugged individualism, trickle-down economics, child labor, unregulated business, barely a union movement, we would not have been able to mobilize as quickly as we ultimately did to unleash the full potential of big government, big labor and big, well-regulated business that made World War II a war tailor-made for us to win. So pundits quarrel about the New Deal, right or wrong, could it have been done better? They always overlook the fact that this is what enabled FDR and the lieutenants not only to save democracy during the 30s, but ultimately to save civilization itself.
I might add to that litany of things you just listed, Derek, a neutered Supreme Court that enabled government to mobilize with certain authority and powers. But someone can ask that question in the Q&A. So I want to get in 3 more questions. So this is the speed round. And then we're going to open up to you for some Q&A. So I want to talk about climate, race, and democracy. So climate first. FDR and his lieutenants faced their own climate crisis. Ours is a bit more dire, but they were facing, and Scott, you've mentioned this several times, the Dust Bowl. So what connections and lessons learned can you draw for us in terms of how the 4 lieutenants and the president responded to their climate crisis in their time? Scott.
Well, the parallel is overwhelming. The Dust Bowl was man-made. It was caused by unsustainable crop practices, which is one of my grandfather's first missions coming in, soil conservation reform, teach farmers how to do contour plowing instead of up and down the hills, to plant barrier crops and to alternate crops to conserve the soil. But the only difference between the Dust Bowl and today's climate crisis, they're both man-made, is that soil sits on the ground. It doesn't travel around the earth. Climate change is in the air, and we all have the same air that moves constantly around the earth. So the question is, having created the crisis, don't we have an obligation to future generations, to the sustainability of the very planet we live on? Don't we have an obligation to do everything possible for future generations? And that's why future generations are the one yelling at our generation for not doing not enough. Tremendous parallels there about the crisis and the role of government stepping in.
America, with its history of minimalist government, had never thought of having a soil erosion service to teach the farmers, to subsidize environmental concerns, building barriers of trees. This had not been on anyone's expectation of government. It was environment, to be sure. It was also human capital, as we call it today, enabling Americans to have access to health care, to have a decent wage. Again, what FDR called common decency. You can see so many parallels between then and now. Of course, they're different in form and function, but who would imagine that in 2023, yet again, we're dealing with child labor, or yet again, we're dealing with the right to join a union. When FDR, Francis Perkins, and the other lieutenants came into office in 1933, sure, you could join a union. You could also be fired the next day. These were the safeguards that they put in place. And ultimately, this united America by 1940. The evidence for that is the candidate that the Republicans ran in 1940, Wendell Willkie, who 2 years earlier had been a Democrat. And the Republican platform by 1940 was a watered-down version of the New Deal. America, in my view, had been brought together. So much had been reclaimed in our national destiny, and we were poised, therefore, to take the next step, and as FDR and each of the 4 lieutenants envisioned, and as Vice President Henry Wallace laid out in his brilliant 1942 speech, Century of the Common Man, these were the ideals that Americans were fighting for all around the world. The century of the common man ideals were to enable the rest of the world to decolonize, to have their own versions of the New Deal. It was not the American century, quote unquote, that the publishing tycoon Henry Luce had laid out in 1941, in which America would run roughshod over the world at the point of a gun. No, the century of the common man translated FDR's talk of common decency to a world scale, and that's what they were envisioning for post-1945.
So Derek, you just mentioned accurately FDR and the four lieutenants bringing the country together. And I also want to raise the contradiction because you do cover this at length in the book. Particularly, I want to raise Black people and the plight of Black folks and race. And so we know now, and again, you cover this deeply and extensively in the book, there were some exclusions in the New Deal programs. Occupational exclusions was how they were framed. Farm workers and domestic workers, which just happened to be disproportionately Black people in the South at the time, excluded from National Labor Relations Act, excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, excluded initially from Social Security. So talk to us about some of the unfinished business of these exclusions, but also I know you have some stories about Harold Ickes and Henry Wallace in particular, and some of the internal conflicts around this inside the administration. So what lessons do we learn about these racial exclusions, many of which are still with us today? And what is the unfinished business, this is for both of you, of racial justice from the New Deal?
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
If anyone, certainly not in this room, but if any Americans have doubts about systemic racism echoing through the decades, one can pinpoint key decisions during the 1930s when Black Americans were excluded from the benefits that the New Deal was bringing about, whether it was mortgage subsidies, whether it was redlining, which got its start in the New Deal era, whether it was basic fairness of unemployment. Time and time again, segregation, of course, prevailed throughout the South, but throughout the country, you can see how opportunities to achieve wealth were stripped away very much at that time. It's so easy to praise FDR for much of what he accomplished, but we can't lose sight that FDR, above all, was a ruthlessly pragmatic and self-centered politician who would not take risks if it might jeopardize him politically. He never personally supported Social Security, for instance. That was all Francis Perkins. Ditto labor rights. That was all Francis Perkins. Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, had an enormous remit. He was known by the NAACP as the Secretary of Negro Affairs because they knew they could go to him. Clarence Mitchell, the great builder of the NAACP, said the president needed to get a spine. The myths of the anti-lynching acts of the late, anti-lynching bills of the late 1930s and especially 1940 are particularly searing because FDR made no effort to suppress the primary instrument of terror in the South, under which 10% of the US population lived. And on January 2nd, 1940, the Southern Bulls, led by the superb Vice President John Nance Garner of Uvalde, Texas, came into the Oval Office. And for a variety of reasons, they said, now is the time to pass the anti-lynching bill. It was FDR who stopped it cold because it didn't suit his political planning for a third term. So FDR, on a variety of issues, was a highly self-centered politician. One could go down race, one could go down immigration, and let alone the Japanese-American internment, which was entirely due to FDR. And FDR, by 1945, was not trusted on Capitol Hill by Republicans or Democrats. And finally, in 1944, he proposed something that sounds relatively innocuous to us today, called a National Service Act, which would give him the power to conscript civilians into government service. And you might say, well, it was wartime. It was the very last year of the war when this was completely unnecessary. But by then, FDR was reaching further and further and further. Such power would have enabled him to break the unions, which he was inclined to do more often than not, especially John Lewis and the United Mine Workers. But in its wisdom, both the Democrats and the Republicans on the Hill finally, in March 1945, as this all came to an end, would not give him that authority.
I got an interesting Google experiment for you. Google two things: best presidents ever and most racist presidents ever. And FDR is, I think, number 3 on the best presidents ever list, and he's also on the most racist presidents list. You take a look at all of his 4 electoral maps. The Deep South is solid blue. He made various deals with the devil to not do anything about race. And the legacy, some of it was fixed in the Social Security Act, for example, the exclusions, but the legacy obviously still lives on. I think of it personally as no coincidence that within 12 hours of my grandfather seconding FDR's nomination to be for his 4th term in 1944 at the Chicago Convention, within 12 hours of him giving that speech where he called for an end to the poll tax and an end to Jim Crow, Harry Truman was chosen to replace him as vice president. And my grandfather went on to run for president in 1948 out of frustration with Truman, largely on the issue of race and women's rights. So it was an imperfect administration.
And I can't help myself. I just want to add another layer, because it's not a neat story around race and racial injustice in the New Deal, because I also want to point out, and this is the contradiction, and I'm a Chicago kid, so I grew up in a political machine. Northern blacks who did have the right to vote were Republican until 1932 and supported the New Deal and FDR where they could vote, also fully recognizing the exclusions, right, for their Southern brethren and sisters. So there's something complex here, right, about, I would say, how strategic black voters are when we can vote, right, especially in the North. Obviously, black voters could not. They weren't voters in the South, right, until 1965. But it did spark a realignment because black folks left the Republican Party, at least Northern black folks did, and were part of the New Deal coalition. So it was a very uneasy coalition and full of contradictions, as you both have pointed out. The last question, then we'll open it up because I want to pivot from racism to fascism and democracy. And as we know, FDR and his lieutenants faced both foreign and domestic threats. And particularly, I'm thinking of Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, who are both aligned with fascism. Henry Ford, who was, I think, the richest man in America for some point at that time. So can you both talk about how FDR and his team grappled with these threats, both the threats of fascism from abroad, as well as the internal threats of fascism at home, and particularly in the Deep South?
If I can just jump in for a second, keep in mind that during this 12-year presidency, you had at the core these tough, bare-knuckled, enduring operators who had a vision and who played ruthlessly themselves, every bit as ruthlessly as did FDR. And when it came to Charles Lindbergh, the German-American Bund, the power of the Republican Party, which had a war chest at least 3 times that of the Democrats in 1940, FDR and the lieutenants played very, very rough indeed. You can see that in the rhetoric. If you look deeper, you can see incidents of setups and examining taxes and so forth. It was no holds barred, but on either side. And here we see the Democratic Party, not for a moment hesitating to play rough and focusing on execution. And that's what these 4 did. You did not cross Frances Perkins. Yes, she might look like a demure upper-class matron dressed in black, but nobody would cross her because they would get eviscerated by her statistics and her wisdom and her knowledge. You didn't cross Harold Ickes either because Harold Ickes controlled thugs in the park police, and he had his own investigators. So on and on and on. They were playing as much for keeps as were their opponents.
Well, one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize until they read this book and a deep history of the New Deal is how America was flirting with fascism in 1932. I mean, the circumstances were so dire, the same pressures that brought Mussolini and Hitler to power were at work in America. And they were represented by some of our greatest heroes, Lindbergh and Henry Ford. And Lindbergh was a national idol. And he openly praised Hitler and Nazi Germany. And just like 1994, there was a turning point in Southern Africa. South Africa chose peace and reconciliation, and in neighboring Rwanda, they chose a genocide. It was one of those inflection points. And I credit my grandfather for being a vigilant anti-fascist from the beginning. And in fact, his most famous writing as vice president was in 1945, a piece in the New York Times called "The Danger of American Fascism." When he warned, I swear he must have been talking about Trump, because it describes Trump perfectly. The rich and powerful who want to merge corporate America with government to make government an instrument of large corporations to further their own power and wealth and privilege. And that is what animates our foundation actually today. This struggle between what Derek described in my grandfather's Century of the Common Man speech, which is all about helping lift up ordinary folks, not only in America, but around the world, and the dangers of this corporate controlled government. And so our foundation, our vision is driven around standing up for the common man against the forces of American fascism. And I'll just add, the struggles were playing out abroad, internationally, then as they are now. People have just invade another country, authoritarians taking over without cause and solely to enrich themselves. Vladimir Putin, I understand, is the richest person in the world. But the parallels of fascism are domestic and international.
And one final thought, Scott, since you mentioned the perils internationally. FDR had the military completely in the palm of his hand. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He would brook no disagreement or insubordination from the military. Time and time again during the war, as he delved into strategic planning, indeed with Wallace as well. He would say, war is too important to be left to the generals. There was no question of a military-industrial complex running roughshod over the FDR White House and the 4 lieutenants.
So with that, we want to take a couple of questions. If you could just stand up and introduce yourself, please, and please project. So let me collect 2 or 3, and then we'll have our.
Can you hear me? Yes, very well. Okay, great. I want to take Dorian up on your question about the courts. And my name is Marsh Baker. I work for the American Way, an organization formed a half century ago, nearly by Norman Lear, to fight the forces of authoritarianism that we're talking about. So we formed this organization in 1981. We're still here. And I am asking you this question on a day of incredible joy, because one thing that I think distinguishes this president from other previous presidents is how he's really trying to repopulate the court. And today, literally about 3 hours ago, Nancy Ickes, who is a premier voting rights advocate, worked for the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, was confirmed. That covered Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, nominated by Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff, and is the first Black woman ever on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. We are doing what we can on the lower courts, but the Supreme Court is a huge problem. So I would love to get the panelists' opinion about the dynamic around the court, what worked, what didn't work, what lessons can we learn for the place we are now in, about, despite our best efforts to repopulate the lower courts, the Supreme Court is very far away from our being able to achieve the kind of transition change we need to get a court that actually serves people.
Hold on that. Let me collect 2 more. Thank you. Please, Ellen. And by the way, brilliant young leader at People for the American Way, Savante. Congratulations. And I'm really happy you raised that question. Boss.
Nice segue, brilliant young leaders. So I want to dig a little bit deeper in the role of social movements.
Yes.
In pressuring FDR and Biden to take transformative action. We have some of the leaders of the Sunrise Movement here. In the room that have played an incredible role in building not what we refer to rhetorically as intersectional movements, but justice-based solidarity movements in unprecedented levels. So I want to hear about how these movements have not only pushed FDR and Biden to take transformative action, but also how we hold those presidents and their administrations accountable to sustain it and implement it in the face of industry resistance, which happened and is happening and will happen.
Thank you, Ellen, for the social movement question. Let's take one more here, please.
I'm Greg Squires from George Washington University. Your comments on race caused me to ask, did FDR have any thoughts about the use of the atomic bomb? Wasn't it available when he was still alive?
Okay, so we have 3 questions on the floor. The first is a big question about the courts. And I want to point out, I think I saw earlier this week or late last week, Planned Parenthood actually has taken also a pretty aggressive approach to court reform. So what lessons learned from the showdown with the Supreme Court in the 1930s? It's question 1. Question 2 was Ellen's question about social movements, workers, farmers, students in particular in the 30s, young people now. What lessons, what were the interactions between, I think of A. Philip Randolph, for instance, threatening a march on Washington in 1941, long before the 63 March on Washington as one example. What are the lessons learned from social movements, and then the atomic bomb question?
I'll try to be quick, because that's a lot of stuff. I think that the court piece, FDR's effort was really hand-handed and possibly his worst policy failure ever. I think the commission that recently completed its work on reforming the Supreme Court has come up with something much more viable. The idea of term limits and adding some justices. And I think the mood is so different now. I mean, after Dobbs, the Supreme Court is polling at like 10%. It's polling lower than Congress. It's that bad. So I think the political mood is riper for Supreme Court reform now. On the question of the political mood or popular movements, I love the story of A. Philip Randolph and Sidney Hillman going to FDR and demanding certain labor reforms, and FDR tells them, I agree with you, now go ahead and make me do it. You got it. He knew what the right thing to do was, just as he did on race, but you had to make him do it, and they didn't make him do it on race. But labor, the largest movement in the country at the time, had vast power, and they were repaid with all these great reforms Eric has mentioned. On the atomic bomb, Derek and I were just discussing this. I personally, yes, FDR knew about the Manhattan Project. It had been going for 2.5 years at the time of his death. I'll tell you one person who didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project on August 6th, 1945, was Harry Truman. He came and he did not know that the Manhattan Project existed. My grandfather served on the Manhattan Project for 2 years. I personally think that if FDR had died a few months earlier and my grandfather had become president, he would not have used the atomic bomb to kill several 100,000 women and children in the cities. He would have called up Hirohito and said, I'm going to give you warning, and then you're going to see something terrible unleashed. Or he would have just dropped it on a military installation, but he would not have killed innocent women and children. And I think that was the most shocking abrogation of human rights in history, what Truman did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Pivotal moment in early 1941. It was Henry Wallace who brought the key scientists into the Oval Office to talk to FDR, because the scientists knew that they could work through Vice President Wallace as an intellectual, as a scientist himself, a capacious mind. He turned it over to the key scientists. They made their case. It all happened very quickly in 15 minutes. As they were walking out of the Oval Office, and this is a sign of FDR's greatness, despite all, FDR said, oh, by the way, what will you do with this horror after the war has ended? He was already looking ahead toward how atomic energy and atomic weaponry would be used. If I can jump in for a moment on the courts. The court was nearly medieval in the 1930s. That's what FDR and the lieutenants called it. It had a medieval block of 5 reactionaries in it. What do we mean by reactionary? Well, one can identify 2 justices that would stand up and get out of the chamber when the one Jewish justice on the court would enter, and who would read newspapers when he spoke. These were reactionary Republican lawyers. They were Republican because the Republicans had had such a continuing grip on the federal government since the Civil War. Everyone wanted the court to change, and it could have easily been changed. FDR, the lieutenants, knew there was no magic number 9, but as Scott suggested, FDR went about it in a foolish way. He sprung it on Congress. He discussed it with no one. He came up with a tortured rationalization that he was doing this because the elderly justices were working too hard. He indeed, for a time in spring 1937, had won because Congress said, fine, we'll give you 2 more justices. Take it up to 11. He wouldn't compromise. He wanted to win entirely.
What was the number he wanted?
He wanted 12. And he overreached not only on the Supreme Court, but he wanted to expand the federal judiciary and change the federal judiciary with a similar model that long-serving judges had to be removed. A key point, though, Americans thought utterly differently about the Supreme Court in the 1930s than they do today. Americans still had that, school notion of the court in its brand new temple, its marble temple that it moved into in 1935, as above the fray, as eminent jurists. Justices represented regions at that time, not ideologies. So to the public, it was an entirely different story. They did not want the court trifled with. But FDR could have achieved that. He could have made his case, bringing it to the nation. But this is one of the moments when FDR's characteristics caused him to stumble badly.
Scott and then Derek, what's a question I didn't ask you that you want to close out on with a story or an anecdote for people here to pique their interest in buying the book? How about that?
Well, I think the book does a great job of blending the stories of the interactions of these 5 people, the policy debates, the substance, and the personalities. It's just fascinating personal stories about each of the people. As Derek says, each one had flaws and idiosyncrasies of their own, and this is kind of why FDR likes them and tolerated them. Ickes would yell at FDR, and apparently he carried around in his pocket a resignation letter. Every day he was going to do something to piss off FDR, and he had to be ready to resign. Perkins would hold forth in cabinet meetings for a half an hour. She'd just take the floor and just talk and tell FDR what to do. And Ickes would get in his face about race and you got to get tougher with Hitler. And my grandfather, he did not expect to be chosen. He was not running for anything. People were trying to get him to run in 1940 for president, assuming that no president had ever served 3 terms. And he was the heir to the New Deal. So he was surprised when FDR, who was being begged and appeared reluctant to run for a 3rd term, said, well, I'll do it on one condition. If you give me Henry Wallace as my vice president. And of course, the convention was filled with machine politicians, and they weren't much comfortable with Henry Wallace, who had never been elected to anything. And there was a rebellion growing, and FDR sent Eleanor to try to convince them. And she went and gave her most famous speech ever, the No Ordinary Time speech, describing Hitler laying waste to Europe and war on the horizon. And this is no ordinary time, and you cannot treat this as you would an ordinary nomination in an ordinary time. And so the convention went along with that. But then we have the 1944 experience when the convention was manipulated in another direction. So I'm pleased with how it came out overall, but my grandfather's career did not end gloriously. He suffered an ignominious defeat as the Progressive Party candidate in 1948, having been absolutely devastated by criticism from the Truman camp for being a communist because he wanted to bring back the New Deal.
What you will see in Unlikely Heroes is a very different Franklin Roosevelt than what we know from the newsreels and the fireside chats. The reason that we see a different man is because each of these four, over 12 years, pooled their impressions. They spoke about FDR with each other. They recorded their impressions. They put it into diaries. Eventually, they would put it into oral histories. So you can see their observations of FDR, and it's very, very different from the FDR that we think we know. I'd like to end my contribution to the discussion by looking at FDR's funeral on a cold April 15th, 1945 at Hyde Park. The cabinet members, of course, key members of Congress, the Supreme Court, all went to the funeral. And as FDR's coffin was being lowered, standing together was Frances Perkins, all by herself, as always. There was Henry and Ilo Wallace, and there was Harold and Jane Ickes, all standing together in a group. Harry Hopkins had been too sick to be able to come up from Washington. And Henry Wallace notes this in his diary and in his oral history. Frances Perkins said emphatically, "God rest his soul," which is what Episcopalians say at a funeral. But Henry Wallace recalled this with Frances years and years later. He said, "It was the way you said it. God rest his soul." And Frances Perkins, who had known FDR the longest, knew that this was a tormented and tortured soul. And it was this soul that was being delivered into God's hands. And the War Department that day reported FDR as killed in action.
Just add one more uplifting story about the funeral. As the train, I tell this story almost when I was campaigning for Congress 5 years ago. I love this story about FDR. The funeral train was passing through Washington, D.C., and a man was standing there, a laborer, with his hand over his heart, tears streaming down. And a reporter was standing next to him and said, "Did you know him?" And I said, "No, but he knew me." And that's empathy. Is that Joe Biden? But they felt he got them, ordinary working people. That's the kind of leadership we need.
Yes, you can clap for that. As we close out, I want to do some thank yous. Please first be sure to buy the book. Derek will sign them. You can ask him all the questions you have, as well as Scott Wallace. Thank you to Busboys for hosting us. I'm very happy. This is my neighborhood Busboys, so I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Busboys. Thank you to Ellen and the Wallace Global Fund. Thank you to Tope and IPS. And you should buy Tope's books too, by the way. He's a superb author. Thank you to Scott Wallace. And thank you, Derek, for writing this book and for sharing it with us and sharing a different view of the New Deal, of FDR, and especially the four lieutenants. Thank you very much for this book.
Thank you, George.
I'm happy to. Maybe I'll get another beer. Pause.
You should do that too.